Hey, welcome back. In this lecture, we'll look at irrigation economics and specifically the crop water production function. Okay, so this lecture will begin with some of the people and programs that might influence farmers' irrigation decisions, some of my experiences, and actually some graduates of our department. And then we'll look at the first part of the chapter, which is the crop water production function. And the chapter actually presents three perspectives on irrigation economics. The first is what we'll cover today. So that's the benefit of applying a certain amount of water versus the yield that you'll get. And so that's the crop water production function. And so from an economic perspective, there's a point at which applying more water to a crop costs more than the additional yield that you'll get, because there's a decreasing return when you over irrigate. And in the next lecture, we'll look at engineering economic analysis and the economics associated with irrigation consulting, sales, and design. And just one comment is for those of you doing the economic analysis for your projects, that's the thing that you'll be looking at, and specifically the cash flow diagram, 20-year cash flow diagram. So that's probably what you should focus on. So as you might have heard, irrigation economics is a critical discipline in the Southwest United States. And we're undergoing water stress. So we have inadequate water, and that's really across the whole region. For example, in West Texas, the Ogallala Aquifer, which covers 8 states, but it hasn't dropped in every state. It's dropped to a level in West Texas, like 300 or 400 feet, at which farmers must decide whether they're going to keep farming or not, because the cost to pump the water up is so expensive. And as we all know, in central Arizona, farmers were cut off from Colorado River water. And even in some of the higher priority zones like Yuma and Imperial Valley, there's some talk of them giving up some of their water rights, which they don't want to do. So the question is, with reduced amount of water, do farmers plant low water use crops such as Waiuli, which I know that one of your groups is going to be looking at? I'm very happy to hear that. Do they leave some of their land unplanted and plant fewer acres, such as a high value crop like alfalfa? And also, do they attempt to save water by investing in high efficiency center pivot irrigation systems like this, which is irrigating alfalfa? So irrigation economics answers those questions. So we're very proud of one of our former students, Nick Kenny. He has a consulting company in Phoenix, and he actually does exactly what we're talking about in our lecture today. I just pulled this off of LinkedIn. It's not private information. He's a registered professional engineer with a broad agricultural background, one of which was working for Howard Works. He also worked at Texas A&M University in Extension and helped produce this, this booklet, which I'll get into next time, Economics of Irrigation Systems. And he's just done a lot of consulting on helping farmers to make good decisions regarding irrigation. One of the factors that can influence farmers' decisions is government assistance. As you might know, or maybe you don't know, the EPA uses the incentive program of a stick. You know, they'll hit you if you do something wrong. Whereas the USDA has the carrot incentive program. They'll give you money to do good things. So one of their programs is through NRCS. They provide government assistance when you engage in good practices. And one of the good practices is irrigation. So for example, when I was in Washington State in the lower Yakima Valley, and this is a vineyard in the lower Yakima Valley, there was a big problem with soil getting washed into the Yakima River. Not only polluting the river with sediment, but also causing soil erosion and ruining soil health. So the National Resource Conservation Service had a program where they would give farmers money to install pressurized irrigation systems, whether sprinklers or drip like this system. And then the farmers not only wouldn't be washing, water down these hills and eroding the soils, but they could also plant a cover crop, which would actually eliminate all soil erosion. So the incentive program they had at that time was the government would pay for the main line. And that was enough to just, every farmer took advantage of it. So that was enough to cause farmers to want to convert over to pressurized irrigation, which, maybe costs $1,000 an acre for a system like this. Okay. And I just want to put in a plug for NRCS. It's a great place to work for people such as you who have a knowledge of soils and irrigation. And another of our graduates that we're very proud of is Blythe. Her name used to be Supothka. Now she has an even more complicated name, Koyi Tiwa. But she's worked at NRCS and Flagstaff for the last, I think, 20 years. And she's always commented on the positive work environment there. They have great training. It's basically an 8-to-5 job. And it's a good mix of indoor and outdoor work. So if you're looking for a place to work after college, NRCS is a great place. Okay, and then I was reading about this farmer who, actually this isn't the farmer, I think this is the NRCS irrigation agent. But now they pay just for the trenching, which doesn't sound great. But anyway, I'll just play this video. This farmer seemed to think that was a good thing. I hope you guys can hear it in Zoom. Let me see. I think I can include.
Audio shared by default.
It's shared by default?
I believe so.
I'm going to share sound though. It says share sound.
A micro-irrigation system is just a way to get a smaller droplet of water out of the irrigation system and onto the tree, so you're using less water out of the system as a whole. A micro-irrigation system simply creates a circle around the root zone and can go straight into the roots of those trees.
I farm around 125 acres total. Out of that, about 82 acres are prunes, about 42 acres are almonds. I decided to interplant the trees, and when I planted the trees, I could see with the flood irrigation, about 400 or 500 trees will die, either from lack of water or too much water. And only solution I had was the...
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to do that.
Out of that, about 82 acres are prunes, about 42 acres are almonds. I decided to interplant the trees, and when I planted the trees, I could see with the flood irrigation, about 400 or 500 trees will die, either from lack of water or too much water. And only solution I had was the micro system, which I heard about it already. So I contacted NRCS about that.
An application goes in, we check and make sure that the hydraulics of the system match up all of our specs and standards, and we assist financially if that's also necessary. And it's trenched and put into the orchard, and then we come out and we check it and make sure that it's running at the right pressures and at the right gallons per minute. And once that's all checked off, the system's good to run. Some of the other benefits of a micro-irrigation system are less overdraft on the aquifer, there are less weeds in your orchard, there's less management involved, it's a lot easier on labor. It can run an entire orchard with just one person as opposed to having to hire 4 or 5 outside workers.
And saves a lot of water, I can tell you that much. With this system installed, I can last more years than I could before.
Okay, and actually, that's exactly what happened up in Washington. We would design the systems and then we'd take it over to the NRCS office and they would check it over and then give the farmer the money. Well, we have a similar program in Arizona. Irrigation uses 74% of the water in the state of Arizona. And so because of the water shortage, the state legislature actually appropriated $30 million last year to pay farmers to replace their surface irrigation systems. Remember last time I showed you a graph of 93% surface irrigation in the year 2000. But they're paying farmers to replace their surface irrigations with higher efficiency irrigation systems. So farmers or ranchers who are accepted into the program get $1,500 per acre just for free and up to $1 million per farm. That's amazing, to help pay for improved irrigation systems and that show a projected water savings of at least 20%. So that would be like converting over to gravity drip, subsurface drip, or center pivots, basically. And the latest statistics I heard was that the state already spent $23 million, and actually the farmers matched with $17 million in order to get the systems they wanted. So they could only get 1,500 per acre, but maybe they wanted a system that was 2,000 or 2,500 per acre, such as a drip system. So the state allowed them to cost share. Okay, let's start in with a textbook. And this is the crop water production function, which is determined for a crop in an experiment where the researcher applies different amounts of water to different treatments and records the yield in each treatment. And this is actually what we do all the time in our experiments up at Maricopa Ag Center. We have treatments with like 100%, 70%, 50% of required water, and then we record the yield in each treatment. Yes? This was a cotton research project. So, one thing you can measure is biomass, and then the other thing you could measure is yield. Well, the biomass might have more of a linear relationship with applied water, but sometimes the yield would have a more curved relationship, especially with like cotton, or if you apply too much water, you get a lot of growth, but you don't get so much cotton. And same with Waiuli. We did a lot of experiments and had a lot of debates about whether there was a direct linear relationship between applied water and yield. And yes, there is a direct linear relationship between applied water and yield, but there's not a direct linear relationship between applied water and rubber. So that's an important distinct. Did I say applied water? Yeah, there is a direct linear relationship between applied water and biomass growth, but the rubber, that's just like 5% of the plant. The rubber is the yield along with resin, right? Yes, say it loudly. Okay, ET is evapotranspiration. And so that's the water that the crop uses. That's the blue line. The red line is the water that you apply to the field. Okay. And so the lower axis represents two amounts. One is the applied water depth by irrigation and rainfall. So this is how much water infiltrates into the soil. And then the other amount that it represents is the transpiration, which is what goes through the leaves, or the evapotranspiration, which is the combined water loss through the leaves and through the soil. So evaporation from soil, transpiration from the leaves. Okay, and then on the left axis is the cotton lint yield. So, what I'd like you to do is do, in-class exercise 2.1, which is one of your questions on your quiz. And just, is it Blake?
Yes.
You might want to, maybe you two guys could join this group over here, so you can discuss it. So discuss in your groups and actually write it down because, you know, that's one of your questions. Why does increasing the depth of irrigation water applied per season reach a point of diminishing returns? So, you know, the line is curved over. So you're applying more water, but you're not necessarily getting a whole lot more yield. And why is there a nearly linear relationship between evapotranspiration, which is ET, and yield, and a non-linear relationship between applied water and yield? So go ahead and get in your groups and you can discuss that. And so we have 6 participants online, which is basically a group.
Dr. Waller,
Yeah,
I'm on my mind.
so why does increasing the depth of irrigation water applied per season reach a point of diminishing returns?
Can I go, Dr. Waller?
I hear you, Joseph.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
I would assume that as they reach a point of diminishing return because of the fact that as you apply more water, it requires the plant to use more time and energy to transpire that particular water out of its leaves, and therefore it diminishes the actual yield that we're looking for. At the same time, we also discussed the fact that with the excess application of water, it also decreases the mineral nutrients in the water through leaching, and therefore also takes away from the plant yield.
Okay. Any other ideas?
There's a simple idea, and the simple idea is that the soil can only hold so much water at the root zone. So at some point, gravity is just going to the water is just going to drain due to gravity to a point where the plant actually cannot utilize the water.
Right, so that would be one reason that water would leach below the root zone,
Right.
because you just put on too much
Or surface
irrigation.
runoff.
Or surface runoff, if you're, yeah. So that would be one reason is you're increasing irrigation inefficiency or decreasing irrigation efficiency. Okay. And then Joseph brought up some plant-related reasons. Any other plant-related reasons you can think of?
I feel like what you're saying, it might increase the biomass, but not increase the yield.
Right.
Like cotton, where it'll grow a lot of leaves, but not necessarily a lot of bulbs.
Right, so a lot of vegetative growth, but not reproductive growth. That's another reason. Okay. The second question is, why is there a nearly linear relationship between evapotranspiration and yield and nonlinear relationship between applied water and yield? So this blue line isn't perfectly linear, but it's close to linear. Yes?
Because evapotranspiration includes the water that the plant actually uses.
Yeah,
So it's gonna go
right. It's using that water, that's what the plant is using and converting to energy through photosynthesis. Okay, great. So Grimes and Elzick, who did the experiment for the cotton graph that you just saw, they had a treatment where they had, or an experiment where they had different treatments with different amounts of water. And so generally with experiments like that, you just use a regression equation to fit the data, and you just would use whatever equation fits the best. I think more commonly, researchers have used like a quadratic equation, you know, the squared and the constant and the linear, or even a higher third or fourth order polynomial. But this obviously fit their data well, so they used it. And although Grimes and Elzick did not include precipitation, it makes sense that you would add precipitation into the equation because, you know, that's water that's being infiltrating into the soil and is useful for yield. So the typical crop water production function has the ratio of actual yield to maximum yield. So here we have an equation with actual yield over maximum yield. So there's a maximum potential yield for the crop. And that's a function of the actual evapotranspiration over the maximum evapotranspiration. So this is more in the range of reduced water application rather than excessive water application. So this is Jensen's equation. He was a famous irrigation researcher back in the 60s. So he also considered the sensitivity of the crop during different phases of the growth cycle. So, you know, the crop is going to be more sensitive, let's say it's cotton, to water shortage when it's putting on bolls than when you're drying the crop out at the end of the season. So you're going to have a function where you evaluate the water shortage at each phase in the growth cycle, and then you add those all up, and then you'll come up with your yield or your yield decrease. And that's why this is a summation sign. So it's the different phases of the growing season. And then this is an equation developed by Dorenbos and Kassam for yield versus ET. And so here they have this crop sensitivity to water stress, KY. So the relationship between actual yield to maximum yield is expressed by this equation. And you can also convert their equation to an equation where you consider the sensitivity of the crop at different stages of the growth cycle. And then this is actually very interesting, but the yield is a linear function of the transpiration. They've done a lot of studies on this. And I actually did an alfalfa literature review earlier this year. And you can use this equation like in Arizona and Utah, where there's completely different climate, and it applies to both. And so the yield is a function of the transpiration over the reference ET. And DeWitt used open water surface, you know, which is not the same as reference ET. Does anybody know why? The fundamental reason why it's not the same? You won't guess, I'm sure. Okay, DeWitt used the water. This was a very old paper, like in the 50s. But DeWitt used the ratio of transpiration over free water surface evaporation, like a pond. But now they use transpiration over reference ET, which is the evapotranspiration from the plant, which might have a similar value on a daily basis, but it's a completely different process. So I'll just tell you because you won't guess. A pond, the amount of water that transpires is not a function of solar radiation. Okay, it's just a function of the temperature of the pond and the temperature of the air and the relative humidity of the air. And it kind of makes sense because the sunlight goes into the water, you know, it might heat up the water, but it doesn't directly cause transpiration or evaporation to occur. Those are two different things. But with a plant, the sun on the leaf directly influences the crop transpiration. You know, it causes stress, opens up the stomates, and I'm not a biologist, so can't give you a very good explanation there. But anyway, pond evaporation is different from crop transpiration. That's why you shouldn't use reference ET to characterize evaporation from a pond. I learned that the hard way one time. Because I did that. Okay. Here's another thing I learned the hard way. Just use what other. No, this is not the hard way. Okay. So the applied water in an irrigation experiment might need to be adjusted for the efficiency of the irrigation system you're using. For example, if you use drip, that would have a different relationship with crop yield versus water than if you used a less efficient flood irrigation system. So that's what this is meant to do. Also, that's what this equation is meant to do. Also, if you add pre-irrigation to germinate the crop, say you're using a flood or sprinkler irrigation system, you're going to waste a lot of water, maybe 1 or 2 feet. So you should also add that in as a consideration in your crop water production function. Yes?
What's CWPF?
Crop water production function. That's the graph that we looked at, the dashed red line. Good question. Okay, so let's talk about water cost, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be comparing the cost of applied water to the increase in yield. So normally in Arizona and the rest of the United States, we calculate the cost of water on an acre-foot basis, okay? And that's 1 acre of water, 1 foot deep. That's a volume, just like a cubic foot. And so, for example, let's say that a farmer uses 5-foot depth of water. And so what that means is during the entire season, he would pond 5 feet, which would infiltrate into the soil. It might happen 10 times in increments of 6 inches, but the total amount of depth of water he's going to put on the field, or she, is 5 feet. So let's say you applied 5-foot depth of water to 20 acres and you were charged $40 an acre foot from the irrigation district. The cost would be $4,000 or $200 an acre. And how much water would the farmer have put on his field in this case? In acre feet? What? 100, right. So he would have used 100 acre feet. And farmers always talk like they applied 5 acre feet. Even though it's 5 feet, they just say 5 acre feet when they talk about how much water they're using, because that's how they're charged. Okay, but because this book is for international audiences, I used metric units. So I used dollars per 100 cubic meters. And the way we're going to talk about it is dollars per hectare centimeters, which is the same, is equivalent. Okay, so I made a spreadsheet that calculates profit due to yield, or calculates profit based on yield, water cost, and sediment cost. We'll talk about sediment cost in a little bit. So the water depth, and go ahead and download that from your D2L site now, because you're going to use it. But your water depth is in column A. So this is evaluating, let's say I applied 40 centimeters. What would be my profit at 40? What would be my profit at 42? So that's on the x-axis here. And then profit is on the y-axis. So the profit is just calculated as the crop price minus the water cost minus the sediment cost. And you can see that I have the Grimes and Elzick parameters in here, but you could put some other crop water production function in there. I have precipitation depth, price of the crop, cost of water, cost of sediment, irrigation efficiency. So that would be the irrigation system that you're using. Crop water production function efficiency. So that's the system you use to generate the crop water production function, like drip. And then pre-irrigation depth, like how much water was applied to germinate the crop that I suppose you could say is wasted by leaching below the root zone. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is in your groups, you can talk about it. And if you don't have a computer, you can just share with somebody else. But find the depth of applied water that results in maximum profit with a drip irrigation system for the cotton crop water production function by Grimes and Elzick. Assume that 7.5 centimeters of precipitation infiltrates during the growing season. The cost of water is 0.0327 per meter cubed or per hectare centimeter. Selling price of cotton is 92 cents per kilogram. Assume the pre-irrigation depth is 0. And the applied water efficiency equals the crop water production function applied water efficiency. So both are going to be 90%. So download the Excel program and adjust it for this problem. And you should duplicate figure 2.2, which is shown here, with your max profit equal to $925. No, I'll show you here.
So do we keep the CWPF efficiency
You-
at 90?
Yeah, you keep them both at 90. So the irrigation efficiency is 90 and the CWPF is 90.
Okay.
And no pre-irrigation. Okay, great.
Because it costs all that.
The sediment is 0. Yeah. Okay, so now I'd like you to do example 2.2 and adjust your spreadsheet for 60 centimeters of pre-irrigation and 60% efficiency for a surface irrigation system. So find your maximum yield for that. So you can see here that the maximum profit is, instead of $900, it's $600 because you have a 60% efficiency irrigation system. So this does not account for the capital cost of putting in an irrigation system, you know? So if you put in a $2,000 irrigation system, you know, maybe that's a $200 per year cost or something, depending on your interest rate and your project life. Okay, any questions on this one? Yes?
So in terms of rating their rent, to the system,
Yeah, it's somewhere around here, right? That's the profit. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about environmental cost. So there's many examples of environmental costs due to irrigation. One of them is soil loss and the degradation of soil health and the sediment washed into rivers. So that's the example we'll use here. So scientists figured out the depth of sediment as a function of irrigation depth here in this equation, where I is the irrigation depth, annual irrigation depth. And so if you applied more water, similar to what we talked about previously, more water might run off the field and carry sediment with it. And many of the soils in this region have been ruined because of surface irrigation. So let's talk about the environmental cost on a per hectare basis. You would just you'd assign it a cost, and the cost could be due to, like, they have to go in and dredge the river, or they have to remove sediment from the water treatment plants, you know, where they're taking water out for cities. That's more likely what the cost is. So that's a direct cost that could be assigned in addition to the environmental damage or just degradation of the environment. So actually, I randomly assigned a cost of 2 cents per kilograms per hectare. But actually, it's written here as 20 cents, but it should be 0.002. So use 0.002. It should be 0.002. Okay, so go ahead and do this example, but now include a cost of erosion. And the way you'll do that is just putting 0.002 in that cell. So go ahead and do that. And I don't think I really have to stop here because that's pretty simple. So you should get a graph like this, where now your maximum profit is, looks like more like $500. And you can see that with this graph, you can pick out the optimal depth of water. So in this case, when you consider erosion, putting on 60 centimeters is the optimal depth of applied water. Okay, so I'd like you to get together in your groups now and discuss this question. Should government charge farmers for sediments from surface irrigation systems that are discharged to streams? Should farmers pay for the cost of dredging and for sediment removal from public drinking water supplies? And should the government pay farmers to convert to pressurized irrigation if a farming region has erosive soils? And at the government policy level, should economic analysis of irrigation systems include all environmental degradation due to irrigation? So let's say you're a policymaker, when you're evaluating like a irrigation region, should you consider the environmental degradation, maybe groundwater contamination or something like that? Okay, go ahead and work on that. Talk about it for 5 minutes. And this is one of your, well, one thing to consider is it's in our government's interest to make farming profitable. So I don't think we want to charge farmers to dredge sediment out of rivers. That's my personal opinion.
Our group decided much more on the paying farmers to get them to convert than charging farmers.
Yeah, so that's the USDA approach, the NRCS approach. NRCS is part of USDA. So yeah, so they pay farmers to engage in good practices, and farmers can cause a lot of environmental damage. Not that they want to, they want to protect the environment too, but it's really is a good practice to pay them rather than using the other approach. Okay. So I have this little section on transferring crop water production functions from one region to another. And I linearized this crop water production function. However, I really don't like this section that I did, so we're just going to skip it. I should have just relied on other people's, like Dorenbos or Jensen functions. Okay, so we skipped those problems in the back of the book. Okay, so another consideration is, what if you have combined stresses due to reduced water and also pests and also maybe salinity? Well, the standard practice is that you multiply all the stresses together to get the reduced yield. So, and this equation looks really bad, but it means example 2-4, where we have 93% of yield due to the amount of water we're putting on, and then 90% due to pests and 90% due to salinity. We multiply them all together. So if our maximum yield is 40, our expected yield is 30. And I also eliminated this question. We're not covering this question in the quiz either, because it's related to the previous question. But just so you know that, this is the standard practice, is to multiply the stresses together. And it applies to plants, it applies to algae, microbes. That's the standard technique. Okay, and the last thing we'll consider is that the irrigation application is not uniform in the field. So let's say you have a surface irrigation system, and this is the infiltrated depth versus distance down the field. You might have 1.2 feet at the beginning. And or this is the relative infiltration depth. 20% more at the beginning than at the end. Very common. So you have to decide how to deal with that from a farming point of view and also from an economics point of view. So you're going to have a lower yield here than here, probably. So go ahead and open up this spreadsheet. It's a little bit complicated, but I think I can explain it pretty well. So the yield is calculated as a function of the applied water at each location. So we've divided and also you have to increase this axis up to 1.6. I think you got it as 1.2. So go ahead and increase that. But the yield is calculated with the Grindkin-Elzik equation in this case, based on the applied water at each location. And also there's an excess leach depth at each location due to extra water. So if our target crop water production function applied water is 60, then if we apply 60 at the end of the field, then we are applying 90 at the beginning of the field, and we're really not getting the yield advantage from that. So in this spreadsheet, column B is the fraction of the end depth that's applied at each position. So in this case, we'd have 50% more at the beginning than at the end. So this would be a really bad surface irrigation system. And then in my spreadsheets throughout the class, we'll have spreadsheets in every chapter just about. The white cells are the cells where you input data. The yellow cells are what's calculated. So I've already set this up for you, but you're going to change these numbers up here. And actually what you're going to do is you're going to change the value in F2, where here we're applying the target depth at the end because that's a 1. But we could decide to under irrigate the end rather than apply the target depth at the end. And then we wouldn't waste as much water at the beginning. So the farmer will make a decision to under irrigate the end so that this might be reduced to like 0.8. So in this spreadsheet, I've reduced it to 0.7. So now I'm under irrigating the end. I'm only putting on 42 centimeters, but I'm slightly over irrigating the beginning, but it's only 63 instead of 60. So in this case, my benefits minus costs, which depends on all these yellow cells, calculating the cost of water, cost of sediment, and so on. My benefits minus costs is $285. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is get that spreadsheet out and find the optimal fraction of the target depth at the end of the furrow so that you increase your benefits minus costs. So how much are you going to under irrigate the end of the furrow? And your goal is to have your maximum benefits minus costs. So go ahead and work on that for a few minutes. All right, so at 0.88, what was your benefits minus costs? Okay, so you saved a lot of money. So you're putting on 88% of 60 at the end of the furrow. And so that means how much are you putting on at the end? Like 55 or 50? $52.8, and how much at the beginning? Okay, so a lot more than 70%. You're putting on about 18% more water, but you're getting double the yield. So you can see that it's important to consider the entire furrow when you consider your target depth of water that you're putting on the field, or your average depth of water. Okay. Obviously you wouldn't have this problem with drip, because you'd have equal amount of water applied to the whole field. Okay, well, that's it for today.